Welcome to Reanimating 19th Century British Monsters in the midst of our wonderful sort of 19th century-ish windstorm.
It was a dark and stormy night.
It was a dark and stormy night. It was like a really, really bright and stormy morning. So we are very excited about this panel. It's one that we put together a few months ago for something else earlier in the year, and then it fell apart a little bit because we couldn't all make it to the place that we were planning to do this panel.
Salem, Massachusetts.
Salem, Massachusetts.
In a supposedly haunted hotel.
So we are very glad to be able to reconvene and to be doing this panel for all of you. I'm going to introduce all three of us, and then we'll just run in the order that we are listed on the program. So our first speaker is Susan Gillman, who is a professor in the literature department here at UC Santa Cruz and my next door office neighbor. Oh, she's a distinguished professor of literature. I'm sorry. She's the author of Dark Twins, Imposture and Identity in Mark Twain's America, and Blood Talk, American Race Melodrama and the Culture of the Occult, and her new book, American Mediterraneans, A Study in Geography, History, and Race, which came out in 2022, traces the strange career of the American Mediterranean. And her paper title today, or her presentation title today, is Monsters of Empire and Slavery, Old Worlds and New. I'm going to be our second speaker. I am an associate professor here in the literature department at UC Santa Cruz and the Jordan Stern Presidential Chair for Dickens and 19th Century Studies. I'm the co-director of the Center for Monster Studies and also the co-director of the Dickens Project. I'm the author of, I can't believe I have to read my own bio. What is the name of my, no. I'm just realizing that I do actually need to read my own bio. Yeah. I'm the author of The Necromantics, Reanimation, The Historical Imagination, and Victorian British and Irish Literature, which came out in 2023, the co-editor of the Routledge International Handbook of Irish Studies, and the co-editor of Race, Violence, and Form, The Referent of Ireland in the 19th Century, which is forthcoming in 2025. And my paper today is called Buffy, Literary History, and the California Gothic. Our third speaker is Michael Chemers, who is professor of dramatic literature and chair of the Department of Performance, Play, and Design, also here at UC Santa Cruz. And he's the founding director of the UC Center for Monster Studies, UC Santa Cruz Center for Monster Studies. Yeah. I'm expanding our purview as we speak. I love it. He's the author of The Monster in Theater History, This Thing of Darkness, and co-editor of 3 volumes on performative monsters from Routledge, Monsters in Performance, which came out in 2022, The Figure of the Monster in Global Theater, which is coming out this year.
Actually, came out last week.
Came out last week.
Yay.
And Monstrous Utopias, which is coming out next year. Michael is also a major contributor to the study of dramaturgy worldwide with his book Ghostlight, an introductory handbook for dramaturgy, which has been translated into several languages.
Thank you.
And his title today is very trashy, The Making of the American Stage Vampire. Here, have a thing. Oh, no.
No, all right, thank you. This is really for the recording. I speak very loudly. So for this panel, which we've organized around a shared problem, and that is 3 different adaptations of British monster traditions at 3 moments in what you could call American time, my little contribution is a brief case study of the understudied Old and New Worldisms, so Old World, Europe, New World, the Americas, in 2 editions, the 2 editions of Frankenstein. 1818 and 1831. So these little references that I'm going to be looking at they start with the 1831 author's edition, where there's a new intro by Mary Shelley, and then the rest come from the earlier 1818 edition. The multiple histories that are woven throughout those references, colonial, social, abolitionist, industrial, familial, are few and far between. This is one of those making a lot of a little papers. And all of them are located at the edges or, what we would call in literary criticism, the margins of Shelley's text. So the paper is going to try to, it's really a presentation, answer the question, or at least ask it, why are these historical references and contexts thus marginalized? In the more of the metaphoric sense, such a little recognized part of the text, and why do they have to struggle to be recognized? So the question is almost more important than the possible answers. What I'm going to do is just give a quick outline of what I would have done with the slides, and then just walk you through a few of them, and I think that might be the best way to do it. I don't know if you can see this.
Feel free to gather closer, gather around.
And I can get up once I'm out doing it, but there's, okay. So, yeah, come on down, I think would be the, yeah. So, we could mash right here.
It'll be like story time.
Oh, I love that, yes. So here, and I will get up. I also have a hurt foot, so that's another problem.
You want me to be in charge of holding
No, I think we can, as long as you can all see something of it. If this is supposed to be a teaser. Okay, so one clue to try to answer that, start to answer the question, is the year 1831, which is the year of the second edition. In 1831 in England, Mary Shelley's novel was republished in a new edition with a heavily revised text and a new author's introduction, which described the origin of the novel in the author's dream about a pale student of unhallowed arts and the hideous phantasm of a man that he created. In America, the United States, in 1831, that was the year of the most famous slave revolt in U.S. history. There are not a lot of them in U.S. history. They're in the Americas. They're much more common elsewhere. It's that of Nat Turner in Southampton, Virginia. Lasted weeks with violence on plantations in the area, and it ended with Turner captured, tried, and hanged. There are numerous connections between stories of the Frankenstein monster and Nat Turner. Nat Turner was called a monster, and so was John Brown, whose name you'll recognize as the best-known white slave, white anti-slavery rebel. He was not a slave himself at all. The white anti-slavery rebel who led the famous 1859 assault on Harper's Ferry, the arsenal on Harper's Ferry, hoping to arm slaves who were part of his group. So what this shows is just that by the 1850s, so after the 1831 edition, the Frankenstein monster regularly appeared, as I'll show you, in American political cartoons as a nearly naked black man, signifying slavery itself, seeking his vengeance upon the nation that created him. And you'll see, I've got a bunch of very good slides, these American political cartoons. Maybe you could. I think that would go to go.
Irish Frankenstein.
Go there. Here's. So concentrating on these later uses of Frankenstein in American political cartoons allows us to speculate on the novel as an implicit, a marginal comment on 19th century empire and revolution, race, slavery, and freedom. The ghostly presence of these few semi-buried references laid the groundwork for these political afterlives. And so this is also we're trying to talk a lot about the afterlives of all of these monsters, and that's the term that's often used. So as such, we have the case of a fictional monster emerging amidst the contradictions of the historical context when race, in quotation marks, appears in modern Western discourse. First, it appeared when the slave trade was at its height during the 1700s, the years of flourishing European revolutions. Think of the French Revolution, 1789. And later, it also, race, again, is part of popular discourse during the so-called age of abolition, when abolitionism was coextensive with the onset of racialist ideology. So conceived within those contradictions, within that contradictory context, the novel appears to be heretical and revolutionary, also appears to be counter-revolutionary. It gives us a vision of the monstrous within the human psyche and without, in society, revolutions that issue in terror or violence, the rule of law that fails to prevent injustice, discoveries of new worlds that are conquered by old world empires, economic productivity via industrial consolidation in factories that exploit human labor, the family itself as it's emerging historically as a social institution with protections against child labor, but with one-sided domination by males and passive females, high infant and maternal mortality rates. Shelley happens to have been a victim of both sides of that sad statistic. Kinship defined by sameness rather than otherness and difference. This proteanness, the creature is both destroyer and sympathetic narrator of his coming to being and his coming to language at the very center of the nested narratives of Frankenstein, and his creator, both as knowledge seeker and overreacher. This set of contradictions within the novel produces what one literary critic, Elizabeth Young, who wrote a book called Black Frankenstein, calls the monster metaphor, a multivalent monster used for both pro and anti-slavery, pro and anti-social rebellion, various critiques, including the capitalism, not just slavery, identified with multiple otherness, so including, you get American Frankensteins in these political cartoons, Black Frankensteins, and Irish Frankensteins. So I'm gonna just read.
You use your computer and I'll show your slides on my computer.
Oh, you're wonderful. Although I think they're different, but maybe not. I did some, okay, so that, I just want you to see, you're very funny. So here, I just want to give you a sense of, thank you, Renee, of the modern afterlives that go all the way through political cartoons in the 19th century to an ad campaign of Absolute Vodka, which then became the subject of an artist's rendition. Just want to start briefly to give you a sense of the texts at the edges, and we'll go through this quickly. The first one, each one of these, I'm linking to a speculative part of some specific aspect of historical context. So the first one is from the 1831 intro. Everything must have a beginning. So think about Frankenstein, the origins. Everything must have a beginning, and that beginning must be linked to something that went before, back and back and back. In all matters of discovery and invention, even of those that appertain to the imagination, we are continually reminded of the story of Columbus and his egg, and quickly from another work right around the same time, Washington Irving's, who does, Ichabod Crane, Headless Horseman. He has a work called Christopher Columbus, 1828. Columbus, here's what the story of Columbus and his egg. Columbus, told by a courtier that others beside himself had the ability to discover the Indies, challenged them to stand an egg on one of its ends. Everyone attempted it, but in vain, whereupon he struck it upon the table so as to break the end and left it standing on the broken part, illustrating in this simple manner that when he had once shown the way to the new world, nothing was easier than to follow it. This, I think, links to this map of the transatlantic slave trade. And you can see the thickest arrows are from the two periods that I just talked about, where the slave trade is at its most intense, and then where abolitionism comes into play in the 1811 to 1870, so the two slides on the right. The next, I'm not going to read all of it. These are the marginal references in Frankenstein itself. So in the 1818 edition, here are just a few examples of where the Americas are brought in a very odd way. So it doesn't matter where it is, Volume 1, Chapter 4, there's a lament at the end that were it not for the pursuit of knowledge, Greece had not been enslaved, Caesar would have spared his country. America would have been discovered more gradually, and the empires of Mexico and Peru had not been destroyed. And here's another one. At the center of the monster's first-person narrative, he's eavesdropping at the cottage of the de Lacy family, and he's learning along with Saifi, who's a daughter of an Ottoman Turk, another marginal figure like the monster. He's eavesdropping as she's being taught language by this family, as she doesn't speak English. I heard of the discovery. I heard of the discovery of the American hemisphere and wept with Saifi over the hapless fate of its original inhabitants. Two visions. Here comes one more. Two visions of the monsters, Eden, and Frankenstein's counter Eden, both of them set in the Americas. I'll go to the vast wilds when he's asking Frankenstein to create a mate. I will go to the vast wilds of South America. My food is not that of man. I do not destroy the lamb and the kid. Acorns and berries afford me sufficient nourishment. My companion will be of the same nature as myself. Frankenstein's reaction, the counter Eden, even if they were to leave Europe and inhabit the deserts of the New World, a race of devils would be propagated. This one I connect to yet one more. A database that is of the intra-American trade, not transatlantic. There's a very large proportion of slave sales that occur after the port of embarkation. They're taken somewhere else. And this map is a really interesting one, but what it basically says is the dominant pattern in this new intra-American database is the importance of the Spanish Americas, is it bolded? So as probably the second largest region, okay, good, thank you, of slave disembarkation in the Americas, looking at the transatlantic traffic alone, which is what is usually talked about, vastly understates the importance of Spanish territories. Okay. The last one is about learning language. And it involves very progressive reading that all came from Mary Shelley herself. So the monster says, while I improved in speech, I also learned the science of letters as it was taught to the stranger, that's Saifi, the Arab. The book from which Felix instructed Saifi was Volney, the Comte de Volney, a progressive French Enlightenment thinker, was Volney's Ruins of Empire. Through this work, I obtained a cursory knowledge of history and a view of the several empires at present existing in the world. I learned of the slothful Asiatics, the stupendous genius of the Grecians, the decline of that mighty empire. While I listened, the strange system of human society was explained to me. I heard of the division of property, of immense wealth and squalid poverty, of rank, descent, and noble blood. It's the two sides of empire, the revolutionary and the counter-revolutionary. Here's the last slide, and then I'll just go through and show you the aftermath of this. This is the overall speculation. Why the contradictions at this historical conjuncture when the two texts of Frankenstein are published? This is a quotation from a really terrific Marxist historian of slavery, Barbara Jean Fields. And it's from 1982, an essay called Ideology and Race in American History. It was at the very point in time, she writes, when large numbers of men and women were beginning to question the moral legitimacy of slavery, that the idea of race came into its own. The roots of this grim coincidence are not to be sought in the exclusive realm of race relations, but rather in the unfolding of bourgeois social relations and the ethos of rationality and science in which these relations were ideologically inflected. A whole edifice of forms of institutionalized segregation arose at this very early date, around the period when the transatlantic slave trade was abolished. 1807, continued contrabandly for many years. Here's the institutional segregation. The asylum, should remind Foucault, the asylum, the school, a place of isolation for children, now defined as radically distinct by nature from adult population, and the bourgeois family itself, redefined as a refuge from society and built around an exaggerated consciousness of sexual roles. Race, says the Marxist historian, is a product of history, not of nature. And following this, you can get, Renée will show, here are the multivalent monster. That's what it emerges in these political cartoons. Here are always a black figure of some kind, but standing for, in the politics of the cartoon, sometimes slavery, sometimes capital, in the form of railroads, trampling on the Constitution. Modern Frankenstein, the new Frankenstein, they were all conscious of themselves as producing these different Frankensteins. The American Frankenstein, here Frankenstein is dressed in stars and stripes. You can't really quite see it, but, and the monster is the railroad, trampling on, here it is, trampling on the Constitution. More Frankenstein afterlives are in this. Hank Willis Thomas, a photoconceptual artist who's actually exhibited at the Cezanne Gallery right here on our campus, and has been part of a very recent set of presentations at our camp right here. He got interested in something that he called, based on the absolute ads, absolute power. That was one of his sets of images, and the other was called Afro-American Express. And I'm just quickly going to show you, I'd always been, so here's signifying blackness, is the text that accompanies the image of absolute power. I'd always been fascinated with this image of how slaves were packed into the slave ship Brooks. It was made around 1787 in England. Look at the bottle. To show the horrors of slavery. But at the same time, I was really thinking about this notion of race and how crazy it is. The crazy thing about blackness is that black people didn't create it. It came out of this commercial industry of slavery, where in order to have people as chattel, you had to create a subhuman brand of people and ship them off halfway around the world. That I call absolute, with the E, power. Here are 4 slides of how common this image of the ship Brooks, the slave ship, it circulated all over. It was a very famous abolitionist image. So here's one. This is called, they claim to be the deck of the Vigilante, but it's probably the Brooks. Thank you. Another one. This is Notices of Brazil in 1828. I just wanted you to see that in 1829. On your left is the cross-section of the ships showing how packed the human beings are. Here he is again, to thank Willis Thomas, I'm lured by the language of advertising. I want to use it, but without its identification with commodities. The familiar shape of the absolute bottle, within it, hundreds of slaves, as in a slave ship. And then the last one is his Afro-American Express. It's like the slaves packing the ship, and the slave ship is the American Express. It's the foundation of wealth that gave a lot of power and opportunity. So you can't really see it well, but the outside of so he created his own image of an American Express card. It's the Afro-American Express. The edges are the slaves packed in. The background, instead of being the brand, the company brand, is an abolitionist symbol. You can see the middle image is the deck, the crowded deck. 16 members since 1619, that's the date of the first recorded voyage, and Hank W. Thomas. And he's very famous, for having said, locally world famous, I think that racism was actually a successful advertising campaign. Point. End. Thank you. Thank you so much. It was totally fine. On to
You guys are great. My slides are not important, so I'm not going to show them. They just are a bunch of images from Buffy. So if eventually you want to look at a bunch of pictures from Buffy, you can see it's fun. Yeah, this is my people. What happens to old monsters when they arrive in new places? Especially when they're old world monsters born from the discourses of European imperialism, transhistorically and transgeographically emerging in distinctly new world locations to embody new modes of racialized discourse. In the season 5 premiere of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, titled Buffy vs. Dracula, it's good. The dark imperial Gothic of late 19th century Irish fiction invades the bright California world of Sunnydale, catapulting the show's 20th century characters into the world of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula and all of its cinematic successors. The Dracula in this episode is full of smoldering celebrity charisma that has Buffy starry-eyed when they first meet. "Get out," she says. "You're Dracula. The guy, the Count." This is a really good Buffy episode for any Buffy watchers out there. It's amazing. The episode delights in pitching an over-the-top, beachy version of California against a dark and stormy Gothic landscape that has suddenly and unaccountably appeared right in the midst of it. The Dracula who arrives with his thunder and his medieval castle in tow is both literally and figuratively a traveling one, transiting on cinematic cliches not only from Europe to California, but also from the fiction of the 19th century's fin de siècle to the television screens of the 20th centuries. My aim today is to consider how this particular episode of a TV show famous for turning generic conventions inside out theorizes monstrous mobility in 3 ways: as a means of challenging the lures of literary history, as a way of resisting racialized and racist inheritances, and as a particularly Californian Gothic form that reflects on California's complicity in and resistances to the uncanny transplantation of racialized Gothic violence from British Empire straight to US living room. I'm going to both begin and end today with this last point. In contrast to what we might think of as a distinctly regional California Gothic, focused on California dreams becoming California nightmares, I turn to Buffy to consider the distinctly unregional emergence into California spaces of monsters that have absolutely no relationship to the state's particularities. Monsters that, in contrast, are particularly associated with other locales, other cultures, other politics, even as their presence in California demonstrates their fundamental mobility. Regionalism generally dominates studies of California literature, and a surfeit of recent work on the California Gothic focuses both its archives and its analyses on histories that differentiate California from other locale-based American Gothics. The Donner Party, the genocide of indigenous tribes, famous California cults and serial killers, we got lots of them, the dark underbelly of Hollywood, and California's geological and ecological precarity all form the stuff of the California nightmare. And the surprising lack of overlap in the texts examined by these recent analyses of the California Gothic demonstrates just how deep the well of nightmares runs here beneath us. And I feel like having no power in this moment is particularly apt. But these studies explicitly avoid the limitless supply of Gothics that come from California, but aren't necessarily of or about California. The decades of Gothic films and TV shows that have been developed, produced, and shot in California, but don't dwell on the thematics of the California dream, California nightmare duality. By focusing today on one of these, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which is my own formative California Gothic, I'm searching for a way to imagine a California Gothic that doesn't rely on regionalism, that thinks of California as something more like a form than a place. To do this, I'm going to argue that Buffy develops its own version of the California Gothic out of a fascination with the mobility of monsters, rather than from a preoccupation with the embedded traumas of local history. I concentrate on how the Buffy versus Dracula episode of the show lays bare the ways the series borrows from...
Hey!
Woohoo! Amazing.
Work, Renée.
Unreal.
California dream indeed, people.
Wow.
Amazing. By the power of Buffy. God, I don't even know what
Gotta
this
get
looks
that.
like in the light. I don't understand. So I'm going to concentrate on how the Buffy versus Dracula episode of this show lays bare the ways the series borrows from and reshapes, in a deliberately California fashion, the classic Gothic literary canon, as well as the Hollywood monster tradition that is weirdly uninteresting to California Gothic scholars. In Buffy versus Dracula, which, as its title suggests, pits Buffy against the world's most famous vampire, inexplicably arrived in Sunnydale, California, Marty Noxon, the episode's writer and also a UCSC alum, trades on the endlessness of Count Dracula's movement across centuries, continents, and media, questioning and critiquing the value of originality and origin points in the context of a Gothic tradition that Hollywood has so delighted in unmooring from its 19th century literary beginnings. For this episode, and the series as a whole, California Gothic is the pure mobility of Gothic convention, its capacity to be reimagined and recontextualized in ways that Hollywood's compulsive need to remake old stories particularly exemplifies. The mobility of Dracula is hardly a new story. Dracula is the most adapted literary character of all time, although the Santa Claus people have some arguments about that.
Sherlock Holmes.
He's the most adapted human literary character of all time.
Okay.
This is why the Santa Claus people are
Got
taking
it.
issue with
Got it.
Dracula.
Okay.
Yeah. He's appeared in well north of 500 films and TV shows, in addition to countless adaptations in other media. This manifold Dracula is one that appears in the first few minutes of Buffy's own millennial season. The Dracula who has moved, so this is this very sort of multiplicitous Dracula. This Dracula that's moved from novel through film to, we think, maybe autonomous monster, pressing for entrance into a new screen incarnation of a vampire mythos that may or may not actually be his to play in. This is a Dracula who is insistent upon his own status and power as a mythic origin point, and an inevitable lodestone of vampiric tradition. "You know who I am," he purrs seductively when Buffy suggests he might just be a cheap knockoff. And yet he also borrows his smoldering shtick from the long theatrical and cinematic tradition that's given him such mythic status. From the moment he appears in this episode, Dracula is a figure who foregrounds the presence and the problem of origin points and originals, who embodies their power while also clearly providing a foundation for the show to challenge their cultural hold. But this season 5 episode isn't the first episode to reflect on the politics and powers of Buffy's origin points. It follows directly from episodes in season 4 that tie the origins of the blonde California Slayer into a disturbingly racialized image of primordial Africa, one that feels far more in line with the racism of fin de siècle British imperial Gothic novels like Dracula than with the feminist anthem of late 90s Buffy. The season 4 finale is a bizarre, avant-garde, and racist episode that moves in and out of the dreams of Buffy and her friends. In Buffy's dream, our modern Slayer confronts a figure that we learn is the original Slayer, in capital letters, an embodiment of pure Slayer essence. The original is portrayed by a Black actor, costumed, dreadlocked, and painted in a hackneyed imitation of an indigenous tribal African. The fight between Buffy and the original Slayer in this episode is both haunting and horrifying, as the episode imagines Buffy's resistance to a prescribed mythos as an act of racial violence and denigration. The fight turns in Buffy's favor as she establishes her individual identity in contrast to the original by saying, quote, "I walk, I talk, I shop, I sneeze, and I don't sleep on a bed of bones," asserting her modernity and her humanity against the original's apparent lack of both. As the dreamlike episode moves the fight from a Bacchetian desert into the aggressively upper-middle-class setting of Buffy's living room, any dangerous gravitas the original had at the episode's beginning deflates into pathetic, weirdly animal-like confusion. The episode emphasizes how utterly out of place the Black original is in Buffy's white suburban interior, an alienation that is explicitly racialized when Buffy plops herself on the couch and begins to lecture the baffled original about hair care products. For a television show that's received so much praise for its feminism and its openness to queer plot lines, this episode is shocking for its heavy-handed ethnocentrism, classism, and racism. But this season finale is the episode that leads us into the Buffy vs. Dracula premiere of season 5. And while I have no interest in excusing or justifying its racism, I think that the racist iconography in this finale might have a radical purpose, setting up the series to write back against precisely the kind of fear-mongering, imperialist ideology that vampire fiction has been party to since the end of the 19th century. When Buffy returns in the season 5 premiere, the season 4 finale seems little more than a dream as the show confronts a whole new original with which Buffy must contend: Dracula. Like the season 4 finale, the season 5 premiere asserts Buffy's unwillingness to be seduced into a predetermined cultural mythos. But this time the show pits her modern humanity against cliched literary history, rather than against an offensively ham-fisted and racist version of primordial history. Opening season 5 with Buffy vs. Dracula is the series' self-conscious corrective to racist cliches about origin myths that it posits at the end of season 4, trading lazy, outmoded anthropology for sophisticated critique of the racism embedded in the show's own literary history. Dracula offers a literary origin story for Buffy, and as the season 5 opener asserts Buffy's unwillingness to be seduced into this predetermined cultural mythos, the show pits its own generic experiments against the xenophobic expectations of British fin de siècle vampire fiction. As Buffy absorbs the racist cliché of season 4 into the Victorian Gothic literary cliché of season 5, it exposes both the historical intersections between the two and the deeply political nature of its own generic resistances. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on just one little scene from the series. Maybe two. In one of the most shocking scenes of the episode, Dracula mists into Buffy's bedroom, just as he does in Stoker's novel when he vamps Mina Harker, prowling towards her bed while telling her how magnificent she is, how he's been searching for a kindred spirit like her, for a, quote, creature whose darkness rivals his own. This scene deliberately hovers on the edge between seduction and sexual assault. The chemistry in the bedroom is palpable, and Buffy is clearly aroused by Dracula's suggestion that they're alike, that he sees and is entranced by the dark, violent power she's been trying to suppress. Yet the scene ends with Dracula sliding into her bed and biting her, an act of sheer dominance, not of partnership, and the expression on Buffy's face as he slides his fangs into her neck looks far more agonized than it does orgasmic. Although Buffy doesn't wake up a vampire looking for a bloody snack, she does change after this seduction or this assault. The episode suggests that Dracula's desire to overpower her, to remake her into a version of him, might well be succeeding. That he's right in his suggestion that she already is, or at least has always been ready to be, simply another incarnation of his dark, sensuous monstrosity. In Stoker's novel, such scenes of vampiric seduction, assault, and transformation are precisely the scenes that critics point to characterize Dracula as a novel mired in a deeply anxious colonial imaginary. Your girls that you all love are mine already, and through them you and others shall yet be mine, Dracula says to the British men trying to destroy him as they watch his blood drip from Mina's mouth onto her white nightgown. This scene in Buffy presents a similarly dangerous moment of both vampiric overtaking and vampiric likeness, the colonial undertones of the novel emerging in the scene's constant references to vampirism as darkness. Your girls that you all love are mine already, Stoker's Dracula says, the echo of which we hear in this Dracula's insistence that he and Buffy are kindred, already, before any biting happens. The argument most usually ascribed to this moment in the 1897 novel is that this is a scene of horror because it is a scene of colonial recognition, in which British characters and British readers face the fact that they too are already vampiric predators, that Dracula's campaign of invasion, violence, and conversion does nothing more than mirror back to them the British colonial project long at hand in the global South. This scene in Buffy offers us a similar moment of both violence and complicity. In what ways, it asks, especially in the wake of the season 4 finale, is the Buffyverse already complicit in the assumption, as Ingrid Thaler puts it, that the vampire is a white trope, and that interest in the vampires is a white thing? Assumptions that critics like our wonderful keynote speaker Rafiki Jenkins, who we'll hear from later today, have eloquently countered in the last decade, but that were certainly extant in the 1990s. Sorry, I'm going to sneeze. All right, it's okay. In what ways is the series inevitably embedded in the ethos of European colonial monstrosity that produced vampire stories in Britain and Ireland across the 19th century? In this moment, when Buffy both recognizes herself in Dracula and is nearly overtaken by him, the series faces its violent generic legacy and acknowledges just how seductive, just how easy it is to give into the thrall of an originary formation that's already a part of its cultural DNA. I'm not sure why I tried to hide it, Buffy admits later, when her bite marks are revealed. It does seem like he just has this control over me, even though a big part of me is resisting. The dramatic tension propelling this episode is precisely this battle between control and resistance, between giving in to the forces of colonialist literary history and challenging them in order to imagine a new path forward. In the episode's final confrontation between Buffy and Dracula, Buffy freely admits to the lure of Dracula's long-standing cultural capital and narrative influence. "Do you know why you cannot resist?" he asks her, and she baldly replies, "'Cause you're famous?" For a moment, it's almost enough. That fame, that power, that long-established vampire story. Dracula holds out his bleeding wrist for Buffy to taste, and we see her start to take a drink, and it seems possible that Dracula just might win. This moment, as she drinks in his essence, is the moment when Dracula expects that Buffy will finally understand, as he says, what she is, what's to come. She'll discover her, quote, true nature, her true kinship with Dracula. And somehow, not surprisingly, what Buffy sees while she drinks from him is a horrifying vision that flashes between her own brutal hunting and that original Slayer from the end of season 4. These, this vision suggests, are her true kinships with Dracula. Her violence, and her racist origins. But instead of finding this violence and racism, these Dracula-like inheritances desirable, as Dracula expects her to, they absolutely disgust her. "Wow, that was gross," she says, snapping instantly out of Dracula's thrall and throwing him across a giant table. As they begin to fight, she says, "I want to thank you for opening up my eyes a little." And all of a sudden, Dracula no longer seems like a dark, seductive, impossible to resist cultural idol. Instead, he's just another creature feature, as stakeable as any other vampire. He's not quite as permanently killable as those everyday vamps. He is Dracula. But in the very end, it's his inability to break free from the confines of his heritage of cinematic cliches that is his downfall. As he reconstitutes himself after Buffy stakes him for the first time, he finds her standing in front of him again, stake still in hand. As she says, "You think I don't watch your movies? You always come back." And then she stakes him again. And when he once again begins to reconstitute himself, she says, "I'm standing right here." And he fades to mist that doesn't return. While we understand that he always could return, Dracula does always come back. Buffy's knowledge about the way his story goes, along with her vigilant willingness to challenge it, together vanquish him from the stories and open spaces for new narratives and new mythos to emerge. To conclude, I want to come briefly, and I admit very nascently, back to the question of California, and how this episode might help us to theorize a distinctly unregional California Gothic. As Buffy's friends wander through Sunnydale, trying to figure out which of the many California mansions the luxury-loving European Dracula might be inhabiting, they finally notice that there seems to be a sudden dark castle nestled amidst the sprawling Spanish-style architecture. This is a question from Buffy's boyfriend Riley to Giles, Buffy's watcher. "I've lived in Sunnydale for a couple of years now. You know what I never noticed before?" "A castle," Giles replies. "A big honking castle," Riley says. This is the dark and stormy castle we saw at the very beginning of the episode, juxtaposed against a sunny, beachy California day. The castle that told us viewers that an old cliched Gothic had come to town. But it isn't until this moment near the end of the episode that the characters themselves finally seem to notice that their California landscape has been invaded by a different and pretty anachronistic Gothic tradition. And this recognition gives them power. Their realization that this old Gothic setting is distinctly out of place in their new Gothic world. Their realization, in other words, that this isn't their Gothic, but an old Gothic invading, refusing to change, trying to take over. This is what ultimately gives them a fighting chance against Dracula's overwhelming presence. And yet, of course, it also is their Gothic. They're uniquely California Gothic, because Buffy loves nothing more than imagining monsters moving freely through time and space, while also declaring that they don't get to bring anachronistic and unchanging cultural cliches along for the ride. An unmoored, mobile Dracula is hot as hell. A Dracula revealed to be little more than a collection of hackneyed movie cliches is just another vampire for Buffy to turn to dust. For all that California might be haunted by these old, familiar tropes that it made, this Buffy episode offers us a Gothic in which they're reimagined as outmoded transits to new stories, new power structures, and new generic rules. As Buffy tells Giles at the end of the episode, this whole thing with Dracula, it made me face up to some stuff. Maybe, she says, I could be stronger. Maybe I could be better. Let's call that the California Gothic dream. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing the power back, Renee.
Pretty special.
So I'm not talking about Buffy, unfortunately. I know you're here for the Buffy, but that's okay. My identity is as a historian, And my entry into monster studies was really about trying to answer the question that I saw so many times in literary studies and cinematic studies of why Frankenstein was so different in the book than he was in the movie. And of course, the answer to this question is that there's 100 years of theatrical experimentation between those 2 points, and Frankenstein, the film, the 1931 film, is adapted from a play, starring Bela Lugosi as the monster, actually, in London. And so is Dracula, also adapted from a play. So I'm very interested in the theatrical precedents of our famous monsters, and that got me really into looking just more recently at the role of vampires in America prior to Dracula. And so we're going to bridge the gap between these 2 papers, right? I think in a hopefully interesting way. And following Barbara Fields, I'm very interested in the way that monsters manifest national trauma. And so I'm really interested in looking at this author Boucicault, who's an Irish-American writer. And I'm really indebted to Renée Fox for helping me craft the whole Irish aspect of this, because Renée is an Irish expert and I'm not. So the notion of a restless undead that feeds on the living is not unique to Europe, and in fact emerges from indigenous American belief in a variety of pre-Columbian sources. But European-style vampiric incidents in the U.S. do appear in the historical record, and this is not cultural record, but historical record, as early as 1784, when a certain Moses Holmes of Wilmington wrote in a letter to the Connecticut Courant about a quack doctor, a foreigner, who was treating consumption by talking families into digging up and burning those who had passed on from the disease. All told, according to folklorists, more than 80 exhumations of this kind were conducted in New England prior to 1800, which seemed to accompany outbreaks of tuberculosis. By the early 19th century, vampires seemed to be in full swing in a terrified America. David Cohen writes, some towns in Maine and Massachusetts flipped the exhumed vampire face down in the grave so the body could do no more mischief. In Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Vermont, they often burned the heart, sometimes inhaling the smoke as a cure for tuberculosis. In 1830, in Manchester, hundreds flocked to a heart-burning ceremony at a blacksmith's forge. The town's history says, this is a quote from the town's history, Timothy Meade officiated at the altar in the sacrifice to the demon vampire, who it was believed was still sucking the blood of the then living wife of Captain Burton. Noreen Dresser reports instances of exhumations of corpses and burnings of hearts during consumption outbreaks as well, including an example in 1829 in Woodstock Green, Vermont, when the body of a tuberculosis victim was exhumed when his brother became ill with the disease some months later. Finding an undecayed heart containing liquid blood, the family was convinced that this was the source of the disease. The body was reburied and the heart burned in an iron pot. Dresser also recounts a story from the Norwich Courier of May 20th, 1854, in which the Ray family became convinced that several dead members of the family were feeding upon the living, whereupon the bodies of the deceased were exhumed and burned. Mid-19th century America then, if not exactly in a vampire panic, was not totally unprepared for the arrival of Irish playwright Dion Boucicault to its shores with his horrifying play, The Phantom. Dion Boucicault's first foray into vampirism was actually also his first play. It's argued whether this play was actually performed, but it was called A Legend of the Devil's Dyke, first performed at the Theatre Royal in Brighton in 1838, in which the plucky protagonist, Megan, tangles with a vampire who is an army deserter. Boucicault, under his stage name Lee Moreton, is believed to have played the part of Teddy Rodent, the Irish ratcatcher, in this production. It was in 1841, however, that Boucicault received broad recognition for his play London Assurance. That was his big hit. His play The Vampire, which appeared in London at the Princess Theatre in 1852, was the first time Boucicault appeared under his own name on stage, playing the part of the vampire Alan Raby with a bat-winged cape. This is perhaps the earliest theatrical connection between vampires and bats. And a thick Irish brogue, despite the fact that the play is set in Wales, and the character Raby is English. But contemporary critics of the time note that the accent did not seem anachronistic. Vampires, forsooth, may be classed as cosmopolites, not being indigenous to any particular clime. So like all my contemporary theater historians who investigate vampires in Boucicault, I'm indebted to the research of Roxana Stewart, who surveyed a whole century of theatrical bloodsuckers in her colossal book, Stage Blood, Vampires of the 19th Century. So check this out. It's a great book. The plot of The Vampire appears to be influenced by Polidori's story. If you know the story about how Polidori wrote The Vampire, I'm just going to assume that you do. Planchet's melodrama, which was The Vampire Bride of the Isles, and the earlier Anglo-Irish undead fiction Melmoth the Wanderer by Charles Maturin, and a then recent production of Alexandre Dumas' piece Le Vampire, which Boucicault had seen in Paris, which Planchet and Dumas I deal with extensively in my book, but we'll leave that aside for now. Boucicault was a literary advisor to the eminent theatrician Charles Keene, manager of the Princess Theatre, and Boucicault thought that a vampire play would be a good vehicle for Keene. And so he set about crafting his own adaptation, well suited for the technologically advanced princess, which had provisions for wind and rain, storms, supernatural scenes, water scenes with moving ships, waterfalls, limelight effects, and lavish street scenes. It's a real shame that all these 19th century theaters have burned down. Keene ultimately refused the role, so Boucicault went on himself. The Vampire is a 3-act melodrama which ambitiously spans 3 centuries. The diabolical villain is Alan Raby, a deathless vampire who returns century after century to do battle with descendants of the original human heroes who first tried to destroy him. The play features a dream sequence in which the portraits of the heroine's ancestors, who are previous victims of the vampire, come to life and step down out of their frames to warn her of danger. When Raby dies at the end of Act 1, he instructs his human friends to place his body in the moonlight at the peak of Mount Snowdon, and the moon's rays restore him to unlife. Coming as it did only a few years after the peak of the Irish famine in 1848, there's good reason to link this hungry, deathless, intermittently violent Irish vampire, as Patrick O'Malley does, to that horrible history. O'Malley writes, "In the middle decades of the 19th century, the famine made the persistent representation of the vampire still more brutally resonant, not solely because the vampire evokes an unslakable hunger, but because the famine itself was figured in Gothic tropes. The American reformer Asenath Nicholson, in her Annals of the Famine in Ireland, represented the bodies of the starving Irish as already a kind of undead, caught in a temporarily impossible existence, both in their own materiality and in the lasting effect they have on the memory of the beholder." Furthermore, O'Malley points out, the vampire Alan Raby, whose vampiric nature is only revealed gradually over the course of 300 years, spanned by the play, is originally a Cromwellian soldier from 1660, and this puts Alan Raby into direct conversation with other Cromwellian soldiers from undead Irish writing, including Maturin's Melmoth the Wanderer and Owenson's The Wild Irish Girl. In his 2013 essay, Dracula Anticipated the Undead in Anglo-Irish Literature, Polly H. Davies writes, "Even today, Oliver Cromwell is still reviled in England, and his name is used as an emotive and highly political insult. It remains true that the 17th century is one of the bloodiest on record. It was then that Hibernia's torture really began, with essentially the same battles still going on in the 19th century." Sound pretty good? Okay, good. Yeah, right. The reviews in London of the play were mixed. Queen Victoria herself saw the show and wrote in her diary that Mr. Boucicault, who is very handsome and has a fine voice, acted very impressively. I shall never forget his livid face and fixed look in the first 2 dramas. It quite haunts me. The Queen also commissioned a watercolor of Boucicault in the role. However, Her Royal Highness attended again a week later and was less impressed. "It does not bear seeing a second time and is in fact very trashy." The production the production was done no favors either by the review from Henry Morley in the Journal of the London Playgoer, who writes, "As the delicate process of vampirical killing is exactly after the same pattern in each case, the horror is quite worn out before the career of the creature terminates. Nothing but tedious trash remains. The monster of absurdity was personated by its reviver, Mr. Boucicault, with due paleness of visage, stealthiness of pace, and solemnity of tone. The scenery, especially a moonlit ridge amidst the heights of Snowdon, was beautiful. Unfortunately, the mischief of such a piece, produced at a respectable theater, does not end with the weariness of the spectators, who come to shudder and remain to yawn. It was also called a weird and dreadful thing at the time. O'Malley, however, focuses on what Morley saw as the failure of the ritualistic violence to change as one of the play's most Irish features. Raby's victims, like Ireland herself, seem unable to historically progress and are rather condemned to endlessly repeat his horrific periods of violence with no end in sight. Indeed, Thomas More, in his 1824 work, The Memoirs of Captain Rock, has Rock observe, "While the progress of time produces a change in all nations, the destiny of Ireland remains still the same, that here we still find her at the end of so many centuries, struggling like Ixion on her wheel of torture, never advancing, always suffering, her whole existence one monotonous round of agony." It's fun. Although the play was a hit, despite the criticism, Boucicault himself wrote disparagingly, "I can spin out these rough and..." I won't do an Irish accent. Maybe I will. No, don't do it. Okay. I can spin out these rough and tumble dramas as a hen lays eggs. It's a degrading occupation, but more money has been made out of guano than out of poetry. Charles Keene, whose secretary is said to have remarked that the play was, quote, "a mistake about which less said the better," had a falling out with Boucicault soon after, and Boucicault sailed for America in 1853. But the question of whether the play was guano seems to be complicated by the American resurrection of the vampire under its new title, The Phantom. Stateside, Boucicault radically altered the play. Less than 10% of the original dialogue remained, and the major changes from the vampire to the phantom were first simplification, jettisoning the technically demanding portrait scene, too bad, and the cemetery with its rising tombs, and eliminating many of the small roles. Second, an increase in the proportion of comedy, particularly ethnic humor. And third, an entirely new set of characters in the last act and a different ending. This, critics argue, is enough of a change to grant The Phantom the status of the first American vampire play. But there's a great deal more to be said to bear witness to the transformation of the Irish vampire into the American phantom. The three acts, with their repetitive rituals of vampiric violence, acted by doubled-up actors in case the point hadn't hit home otherwise, were shortened to two acts. The character of Ada Raby, the vampire's descendant, played by Boucicault's paramour, the talented Agnes Robertson, becomes a consumptive in America, perhaps a nod to the American version of transplanted European vampire lore, with its preoccupation with tuberculosis. In this version, the vampire Alan Raby is as much concerned with land as he is with blood. In the guise of a doctor, Gervase Rookwood, he lays claim to Castle Raby using a forged will, written in Alan Raby's own hand, but on a piece of paper postmarked 1750, 4 years before the second act of the play begins. It's very complicated. This possibly a nod to the ever-present American melodramatic villain, the evil landlord. But time itself is as perverse and diabolical as the vampire in this play. O'Malley goes to some pains to point out the many historical discrepancies in the play, writing that Boucicault's vampire is ultimately a manifestation of a dead history, a failure to progress into the future that is as monstrous in Alan Raby as it is in the strangely incoherent history of the play's plot. In the end, though, Henry Morley would be proven wrong in his representation of the play as becoming trapped in ever-repeating cycles. In the revised version of the vampire that is the Phantom, a bloody history is not infinitely repeating, but necessarily escapable, which I think speaks to the American go-get-'em attitude. The play premiered in Philadelphia in 1856. That's 2 years after the Ray family was digging up and burning their vampiric relatives in Jewett City, Connecticut, and moved to Wallack's Lyceum, a prestigious New York playhouse, in 1857. Boucicault kept tinkering with it, including innovating a Scottish version with Raby turned to Ruthven, which is an entirely other story about the history of the word Ruthven and vampires. But I won't tell that now. I don't have time. The play was performed across the U.S. The Yankee reviews were generally positive. The Chicago Daily Tribune writes, only moderately successful in attendance, though the quality of the entertainment offered might reasonably expected to call out an unusually large patronage, the most weird, thrilling, and intensely sensational of all Mr. Boucicault's plays. Putnam's Monthly Magazine recorded that the play possesses a ghastly fascination. And 2 decades later, in 1875, the New York Times would remember this production as a dreadful and weird thing played with immortal genius. That great playwright would not have died unknown had he never done anything but flap his bat-like wings in that dream-disturbing piece. And this is the guy who wrote London Assurance and also The Octoroon, right? So he was a major figure in 19th century drama in America, but they said that he would not have died unknown had he never done anything but flap his bat-like wings. Boucicault returned the play to London in 1862, where it was, perhaps predictably, hissed. If any of my readers on coming up to London feel inclined to go and see The Phantom, wrote one critic, I can only say, don't. It's not insignificant that a vampire meant to appeal to a popular audience in mid-19th century America shared traits with, or to be, in many ways, to be fair, originated, the vampires that would come to be emblematic of the Irish Gothic tradition. Newly brimming with Irish refugees from the Great Famine, the U.S. in the 1850s was seeing the ramifications of British settler colonialism through a kind of double vision. Irish victims of British colonial violence were rising against the U.S. as the nationalist Irish-American Fenian movement, a movement of colonial resistance to which many Americans were sympathetic, while at the same time, the U.S. continued to perpetrate its own monumental colonial violence against the indigenous peoples of America and enslaved peoples from Africa. The American audiences that recognized their own national identity in the Irish attempt to throw off the horrors of British settler colonialism were nonetheless haunted by their own culpability in the continued horrors of U.S. settler colonialism, a form of haunting that appears perpetually in American Gothic texts from the late 18th century to the mid-19th. A truly American vampire, born from the legacies of British Romanticism, transformed by an Irish expatriate into a U.S. stage sensation, needed to be both haunting and haunted, both risen from the grave of colonial violence and perpetrating its own colonial violence, both victim and victimizer. Boucicault's vampire was a monster who could show the audience that the horrors of the British past are deathless in the American present. Thank you. And thank you.
So we have time for questions, but now that we have power back, I'm going to get one of the corded microphones for up here, and you folks can use this microphone. But can I beg somebody to be the microphone runner? Okay, Blake.
We have two volunteers.
Oh, are we okay? Oh,
Yes, we know that one. It's okay.
never mind. Thank you, Blake.
Yeah.
All right, we have time for questions.
I actually do have a question. That's okay. So my question has to do is given to the panel, and it has to do with, I think, some topics that are related ultimately to the primary theme of rebirth and birth itself. In these stories, specifically the kind of, I think, tension in terms of the narratives and the Gothic presence of that fear of an older, kind of evil being rebirthed into the present, and how it's kind of influencing the present in, insidious ways, but also how both of these texts deal with the concept of rebirth of the evil in the text itself. So in the instance of Frankenstein, I think of Victor imagining the race of demons, and specifically the notion that his monster being able to reproduce is the kind of point of that anxiety, imagining the act itself, right? And it's what kind of begets that really violent scene of tearing up the mate's body. And of course with Dracula, the anxiety around Dracula showing up and just turning the women into these sinful machines of evil to perpetuate the vampirism. So I guess I'm curious in y'all's perspective of how that theme of rebirth or corruption or unnatural reproduction speaks to not only the Gothic predecessors, but also the future iterations as well, in terms of the reproduction of this text that is already so anxious about their forebears.
Well, you're making me think immediately of just the whole question of origins, that one of the things that's happening certainly in Frankenstein, is you never can get back to the beginning. I mean, the monster, him, her, itself, their selves, doesn't have an actual moment of birth. That's sort of what's missing. He has everything else. And so you're making me think that that's the problem, is the question of origins. How do you get to one? How do you know? And Renée mentioned something about origins and originals, as another anxiety and that may be part of the birth question too, is if you're interested in translation, is there any original in a series of translations? Or is there just a first, which doesn't have any status other than the first? And it feels like it's liberating as well as anxiety arousing. It's a great question.
Yes, thank you, Blake. So, one of the things that I'm really interested in, and that basically my book is about, is just this question of resuscitating old stories. Like what's at stake in that project of taking old stories and breathing new life into them in these different ways. How does that new life that you breathe into these old bodies make them into something new? How does it, and how does that kind of, that act of resuscitation or reanimation, like how does that also always offer us a way to think about anxieties of adaptation, of inheritance, of influence? Like, what is actually the relationship between past and present? If we're not going to think about the past as always haunting the present, if we're not going to think about the present, about sort of present incarnations of, the Dracula story or the Frankenstein story being haunted by these old texts, but instead, think along this, sort of along with this other model, like it lets us maybe focus really especially on how every iteration of these old stories is quite explicitly speaking to its own contemporary moment. I mean, we say this all the time with adaptations, but, is also kind of creating a dialogic relationship between those old stories and their historical moment and the new versions of those stories in their new cultural moments. Like, they're telling us that we need to think about those two things together without necessarily saying that the new version is, contingent upon or necessarily reliant on the old thing. Instead, it's about, to me, it's about relationality, and it's about the ways that continual contemporary iterations are always demonstrating a kind of a vested interest in, or sort of an anxiety about, but mostly a generative interest in how putting different cultural moments together allows us to think newly about both of them.
Yeah, I just want to. That's great, Renée. Thank you so much for that. I just want to add to that you're making me think, Blake, of a wonderful passage in Borges, where he says, this is an instance of the original being unfaithful to the translation, right? And in which the translation is better than the original, right? And I think particularly, in history in general, but particularly in the history of monsters, you really have to be very careful when you're looking for origins, right? Because they are always already super complicated, super, In fact, I tell my students that if you open up an oyster and there's a pearl inside, right, you want to strip away all of the layers of the pearl, and what you would get is a little bit of grit. Really uninteresting at the end of the day, right? It's the pearl that we're interested in. So that just made me think of Borges. I just want to say that.
This is a question for you, Renée, and also you, Michael. Because one of the things that I found most interesting about vampire stories is sort of how they portray sexual deviance and that sort of symbology and sort of being a symbol for a sort of the fear of the queer. But also you talking about Buffy and sort of how in that episode he represents sort of like an outdated mode of sort of elitism and xenophobia and racism. I think that's also a really interesting take, and I was just wondering how you and Michael sort of see how those two things sort of coexist in the figure of Dracula and sort of vampires in general.
I mean, so one of the things that I quite love about Buffy is that it that kind of across the board it isn't interested in perpetuating queer anxiety. Like, it's interested in putting that on the surface and telling viewers that they should just fucking stop worrying about it. And it was kind of one of the first shows to really do that in the mainstream, with Tara and Willow, or one of the first kind of like teen popular mainstream lesbian couples, and so it kind of, it doesn't really spend a lot of time in this episode thinking about Dracula as a kind of embodiment of a particular queer anxiety. Like it kind of repurposes that anxiety into other ways in which Dracula, because vampires are always just as Michael has said over and over, vampires, like all monsters, are cultural bodies. So so what is in this particular instance, Dracula is kind of representing a different constellation of worries that to me have much more to do with literary origin points than that queerness. And the show kind of, this particular episode, it reproduces the Jonathan Harker's little love affair with the three brides. Giles is the one who, in the basement of the castle that Dracula's in, has this encounter with these three women. And I mean, we are just supposed to kind of delight in the reproduction of that scene, and the fact that what was in the 1897 novel a particularly queer scene in which the problem was a kind of emasculating of Jonathan Harker and female aggression, like all of the ways that people have described moments like that in the novel. Buffy takes it and says, we're not interested in all of those queer anxieties. We're interested in what happens when we reproduce this moment in a completely different context in this new setting. So I like the idea of thinking about it sort of, apropos your question, of, maybe kind of queer anxiety maybe being more, like maybe there's a way to think about the queerness instead as a queering of literary inheritance. Yeah.
I would only add to that, speaking about an earlier incarnations of the vampire, that vampires are always queer. They're super queer, and that moment that Renée mentions in Dracula, where Harker is predated upon by the wives of Dracula, three things occur in that moment that really bother Jonathan Harker, right? And the first thing is that the women are sexually aggressive to him, which is not done if you're a nice Victorian man. The second is that they penetrate him, which is super queer. They start to, right? And the third thing, and the thing that bothers him the most, is that he likes it, right? And so I think that that tells us a lot about Bram Stoker, but I think that since Polidori's story, which I just briefly touched on, which vampirizes Lord Byron, right? Fictionalizes Lord Byron as a vampire. I think that's where we get this notion that vampirism and queerness have something in common, right? And also the idea that you are a creature that turns normal people into queer monsters like yourself, right? So, yeah, anyway. Yeah. Yeah, you bet. I saw a hand back there. I think it was Michael. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is a question for Susan, but part question, part observation. I was fascinated by the juxtaposition of the second edition of Frankenstein appearing in the same year as the Nat Turner slave revolt, and I actually teach those two texts side by side. I use the first edition of Frankenstein in one of my classes. And I'm fascinated by the theme of literacy that runs through both. It seems to me that when the monster is learning what he calls the godlike science of letters, that is so similar to something like Frederick Douglass.
Yes.
covertly learning to read and write. But that becomes something very different in the Nat Turner account, the first version.
The Thomas Gray.
The Thomas Gray version, where the literacy there is almost a sign of his monstrousness as well. So any thoughts on the role that literacy plays in this, in both of these frames, and the way we think about slavery and racial difference, and the role that it plays in Frankenstein, and whether it makes the monster more or less human?
What I think is so interesting about that is the idea of literacy as yet another one of these litmus tests for your pro or anti-slavery position, for your how human is the slave, that whole question, and they're so close in time. So that, that it's 1831, that Thomas Gray, The Confessions of Nat Turner. Also, the question of the emergence of the slave narrative at the same, where the slave narrative is taking the literacy story and turning it on its head, because I didn't even think about Thomas Gray's taking it as part of the monstrosity. And it is the Thomas Gray version of The Confessions of Nat Turner. It's as though he is an abolitionist editor who doesn't do what other abolitionists, who doesn't try to distance himself and say, this was written by this person. So to me, what it does, it speaks to the contradictions, and that's what the Marxist historian Barbara Jean Fields, she points out, slavery did not produce race relations. It produced cotton. It produced, it's a product of history, and that history is so charged. When you look at it, it's completely contradictory. So you're looking at these two texts that bridge the contradiction and the literacy, and then the whole idea that you're getting this post-Enlightenment moment in the 1830s, where all of the progressive ideas of Enlightenment thinkers, they're kind of falling apart. They're being questioned. That's such a. I also think, what if we put the Styron, William Styron's The Confessions of Nat Turner, as yet another one of these afterlives? You could get a great continuum going, like your course. Thank you.
Thank you all, those were fascinating. Renée, I kept thinking while you were talking about Buffy episode of Stephen Arata's essay, The Occidental Tourist, about Dracula as a sort of crypto-disguised Jewish character coming from Eastern Europe and polluting the English body politic. And his motion, that mobility that he has, is central to what makes him very alarming to a British populace living under everything in its place, and whatever that saying is, a proper place for everything and everything in its proper place, right? The Jew is the thing that won't stay in its quote-unquote proper place. And so then I'm thinking, though, about the way that this revitalized Dracula is like a secondary iteration of that. So now it was, quote-unquote, old world Dracula coming to modern England, right? Now it is old world English Dracula coming to modern Hollywood, in essence. But then, and I don't know whether this makes any sense, I can't help but think of Dracula is, of course, also from Hollywood itself, right? And the Dracula that we get in this episode is as much Bela Lugosi as it is Stoker. And, of course, Hollywood's origins are also, like the original Dracula's origins, Jewish.
Oh, yes.
So does that all hold together? Is there anything in that? I have no idea. But that's what I kept thinking about during your essay.
I mean, I love this. That Arata essay is one of the foundational essays. And Jack Halberstam also makes a really, I don't know if you've read Jack Halberstam on Dracula, but also makes a really intense argument about the ways, not just Dracula as a kind of Jewish figure, but he suggests that Dracula is actually an embodiment of anti-Semitic thinking. That and so the ways that that kind of like slightly modulates the ways that a lot of people have suggested that Dracula is a Jewish figure. I hadn't thought at all about Hollywood and Jews, but I think that is a really important point and one that I should think more about. I mean, one of the things that I particularly love about the mobility of the vampire, that, from, as you suggested, I love the way you frame that, from old world to New England, and then from old England to, to New California, New Hollywood, that, that this is in some ways just a kind of reimagining of that always mobile, always transiting monster. And the thing that is dangerous is that monster wanders, that monster isn't stable. But in 2012, which was the centenary of Stoker's death, Ireland put out some celebratory postage stamps that were meant to celebrate, the Stoker's centenary, and the stamps were all full of images from Dracula movies, not from the novel. And the envelope that they came in was an image of Dracula in front of a cinema trying to get in the door, with the postage stamps as movie posters by the side. So, it's a strange commemoration for the author of a novel to completely focus the commemoration on that cinematic tradition. But I think that speaks really importantly to the ways in which, again, the kind of like transiting mobile vampire that is moving, always moving through media, and in moving through media is taking on various kinds of, racialized significances. That the more the vampire moves, the more possibilities for the kinds of othering that he or she can embody, like that I feel like that postage stamp set really kind of speaks to that. But I'm going to think more about Hollywood and Jews.
There is I'm looking it up to see, there's a wonderful book on exiles in paradise, and it's also the title of the film, but it's about all the Jews who left, Europe and went to Hollywood. And so that whole question of mobility, you could definitely, rather than just Jewish directors, it's about that moment of post-World War II.
So I think we have time for one more question because we started a little bit late.
This is a question about the sort of historiography. It was really interesting to see your panel coming from different periods of time. And of course, Susan's paper is showing us what I think is a more elite, theorized, historicized,
Thank you.
things
Always
like that.
Historicized. Always.
No, not that both of you did
But
not
we know
as
what
well,
Kathy means.
But I mean, it's more like this academic conference and things like that. So listening to you going through Buffy, and that, I just wondered about the history of the theorization of the thing, if this, ability to take the Dracula and do the high art show is relatively new and a part of this process of theorization that we're seeing as popular culture, invades the academy and poisons its blood.
Kathy.
I love this. Our panel as a vampire.
Yes, there it goes.
Best thing
We embrace that as an idea.
About time the blood of the Academy got poisoned.
Just not recognized as such.
But I mean, there may be, historians early in the century who are doing high culture things, not just saying this is garbage.
I would have said the people like the Henry Nash Smith Virgin Land and Leo Marx Machine in the Garden, they all went to grad school on the GI Bill. They loved popular culture. In fact, Henry Nash Smith taught in the Berkeley English department where I did my graduate work. We called him pop culture. He seemed so old to us, but he loved dime novels. So I think what you could do is locate different moments across time where pop culture is brought into high thinking. And they were they're historians, not literary critics. We're always fallen and too elitist.
And I mean, I think it's also useful to remember that, Dracula was total trash when it was published in 1897. Very trashy.
Very true.
So just to think about the ways in which trash gets taken up by the Academy and transformed into high culture over the course of time. I mean, this is what happens with Dickens also. And so your suggestion that the Academy has always already been vamped, I think is really apt and really important, because it is true, because it's what we do to texts that makes them into these different, like, categorized spaces of culture.
Yeah, but
It's
for
what we do with
Susan,
images,
it's
too.
translated into
Yeah.
art as well, which is one step beyond the Academy.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. One thing.
I'm good.
All right, we are out of time. Thank you all so much.
Thank you. And that was a wonderful.